I'm Yousef Casewit. I teach Quranic Studies at the University of Chicago. The text that I've chosen to discuss with you today is a contemporary classic entitled Introduction to Islamic Metaphysics, a contemporary Sufi treatise on the secrets of the divine name, Allah, by Sheikh Muhammad Fawzi al-Karkari, who is a contemporary Moroccan Sufi master, whose writings are deeply engaged with the historical Al-Shadhili Moroccan Sufi tradition as it unfolds in Morocco and Al-Andalus from the 14th century onward. The text marks at once a continuation and a development and a revival of the Moroccan Sufi tradition. There are passages or instances in the text where emphasis on direct experience seems to be more prominent in this text. In the writings of al-Karkari, you see an untrained scholar who doesn't graduate from the formal institutions of religious learning in Morocco, like al-Qarawiyyin, who's at the head of a now very prominent and widespread Sufi order, and who's negotiating a space of religious authority by virtue of direct experience and not textual knowledge, who at the same time is producing very high-level texts that are read and studied, but whose authority rests on direct experience. And so it's a very interesting moment for me as an intellectual historian who is aware of these figures who are untrained in the pre-modern tradition, who have formally trained disciples, and who negotiate similar spaces. But in today's context, it's occurring in modern-day Morocco, where religious authority is very much centralized and state-sanctioned and state-sponsored. And the order itself is, of course, very much aligned with the state, but at the same time is carving out a space within this institutionalized structures of learning, where direct experience can serve as the criterion for affirming and claiming legitimacy in contemporary North African religion. What is Islamic mysticism? You might say it places immediate emphasis on direct relation to God, on immediate consciousness of the divine presence. You could describe it as religion in its most acute, intense, and living stage. Sufis emphasize the importance of directly seeing, directly tasting, directly experiencing one's relationship to God. And this direct experience, with this personal embodied knowledge, lies at the root of Islamic mysticism. And there's no mysticism in the abstract. In Islamic context, and I would say generally across religions, mysticism, or Sufism in this case, tends to be cultivated within dogmatic forms, within structures of religious devotion and institutions. And history shows that the great Sufis or the great mystics were faithful adherents to the great religions. And the primary distinction, you might say, is epistemological. In other words, Sufis affirm that the heart of the human being, when it's trained and polished, can have experiential knowledge, can have access to higher realms of knowing than the rational faculty, through a process of self-purification and at the hands of someone who has traveled the path. And this claim, this epistemological claim, is eventually accepted within Islamic theology. So by the time you get to the 12th century onward, by and large, mainstream Islamic thought accommodates Sufi epistemological claims. So it's mainstream, it's not a marginal or peripheral phenomenon in the Islamic tradition. It evolves from informal circles and creates its own institutions. It begins to crystallize as a self-conscious group beginning in the 9th century with the emergence of Arabic compilations of Sufi lore in the central and eastern lands of Islam, especially around Baghdad, Basra, and the region of Khorasan. Sufis tend to look within. You might say they theorize about the renunciant way of life. They chronicle the transformations of the soul on its journey to God. And the classical Eastern Arabic Sufi tradition expresses itself in various forms. You have Sufi treatises in the 10th century, beginning 9th, 10th, 11th, that attempt to establish central ideas, key themes of the Sufi experience. One example is Makki's Qut al-Qulub, the nourishment of the heart by Abu Talib al-Makki. Sufi expressions at the literary level also take the form of hagiography. They present comprehensive information about the thought of each Sufi from various sources in chronological order, called tabaqat, or classes. So for instance, you have the famous tabaqat of as-Sulami, the classes or the generations basically of Sufis up to the time of Sulami or Abu Nu'aym's Hilyat al-Awliya. Then you have Sufi manuals, which are, you might say, they endeavor to present Sufism as a discipline, as a science, to be taught in the madrasa system. And you see this incorporation of Sufism as a discipline alongside law and legal theory and theology from the 11th and 12th century onward in the madrasas or in the law colleges. Qushayri's Risala, the treatise of Qushayri, is the iconic example of this Sufi manual. So you see that there's a standardization that takes place. The Shadhili order is one of the most widespread and longest standing Sufi orders in the Islamic world. Imam al-Shadhili, as he's called, or Imam Abu al-Hasan, is from the 13th century. He's from northern Morocco. We know little about his religious training except that he received a basic education, knew the Quran, knew the Hadith, and probably memorized a substantial amount of them and of the Quran in his childhood. And he's a seeker. He's seeking spiritual guidance from an early age. And he sets out to Baghdad to look for what he calls the Qutb, the pole or the axial saint, the most realized human being of his age, of his generation. And he goes all the way to Baghdad, where he frequents the circles of various pietists, Sufis, renunciants, and scholars. And he's told at some point in Baghdad that you're seeking the pole, or this axial saint, but he's actually in your country. He's in your backyard. Go back to Morocco and you'll find him. So he goes back to Morocco to the north, and he meets this enigmatic hermit at the top of a mountain called Ibn Mashish. Ibn Mashish lived on top of Jabal Alam for most of his life. It didn't seem like he engaged much with society, although he had a family. And him and Imam Shadhili, Shadhili becomes the single and the most famous and the only practically student of Ibn Mashish. When Imam Shadhili completes his spiritual training with this hermit on the mountain, Ibn Mashish, he moves back to the east and settles in Alexandria. He stays for some time in Tunis in a place called Shadhila. That's why it takes on the name al-Shadhili. Then settles in Alexandria, in current-day Egypt, where he establishes a convent or a hospice, where he devotes his waking hours to training disciples, resident disciples who live with him, and also those who come to stay with him for a short amount of period. And there he develops quite a extraordinary reputation as an accomplished and realized Sufi. And he attracts major disciples. One of them is Abu al-Abbas al-Mursi from Murcia, the town of Al-Andalus. The generation of students that al-Mursi trains are the ones who disseminate Shadhili Sufism throughout the world. Now, the students of al-Shadhili, one of the most famous is Ibn Ata'illah al-Sakandari. He's from Alexandria, and he's a precocious youth, a jurist of the Maliki Sunni School of Law. He's a madrasa graduate, and he's suspicious of Sufism. And his father is a disciple of the Shadhili order, and he eventually joins the order and becomes a major figure therein. He lives in Egypt in the early 1300s. He's buried in Cairo, and he's the author of this bestseller, the Wisdom Sayings, Al-Hikam Al-Ata'iyah. This is one of the most popular and frequently commented upon works of Islamic mysticism, and the Maghribis are particularly fond of it, and it defines the nature of practice and devotion and even theory in Maghribi Sufism. It consists of short koan-like, succinct insights or flashes of insights into the nature of the journey to God. Another one is this book here, The Pure Intention. It's a description of the nature or the stages of invoking the divine name and the various it's a commentary on the letters of the name Allah and on the means or how invocation of God actually works. How does it change you? What does it really do? Another book by this Alexandrian Shadhili that the North Africans really love and that defines Shadhili Sufism is this book called the Book of Illumination. And the Book of Illumination is about abandoning self-determination. It's, in a sense, desisting from selfish calculation, abandoning too much concern about one's welfare, and starting to cultivate genuine trust in God. It's a commentary on the futility of personal initiatives, the spirituality of eco-economics, and it invites the reader to reduce their needs, to restrain their cravings through stories and parables and theological expositions. And it's, in a sense, it's a commentary on a famous statement by al-Shadhili himself, who says, if you must plan, and how can you not plan, then plan only for how not to plan. Plan for how not to plan. The figure who brings this form of Sufism into North Africa is known as Ibn Abbad from Ronda, an Andalusian city, and he settles in Fez and becomes a prominent leader there. And from the writings of Ar-Rundi from the 14th century onward, you start seeing the development and self-conscious crystallization of North African Shadhili Sufism. And roughly every 100 years or so, you see the rise of a major figure, a major reviver. So you go from someone like Ar-Rundi to al-Jazuli, buried in Marrakesh, one of the 7 patron saints of Marrakesh. Ahmed Zarruq, very prominent figure as well. All the way down to the 17th, 18th century, with the writings of a reviver of the Shadhiliya known as Ali al-Darqawi, who dies in 1823. And his works have been beautifully translated into English recently by Muhammad Farouk and Michael Fitzgerald. And you can see here correspondences, they're letters. He's writing these letters, giving spiritual guidance to disciples in very specific contexts. Someone is struggling with family issues or with waking up at night or practicing presence of heart, and you can see him, you can see Darqawi responding from within the Shadhili framework to these various disciples, emphasizing key teachings that you find in the works of Ibn Ata'illah Sakandari and the early Shadhiliya. Then in the early 1900s, there was this remarkable Shadhili master called Ahmad al-Alawi. And Martin Lings in the 60s wrote a beautiful and now classic work on his life and main teachings. And Ahmad al-Alawi's order spanned from Algeria all the way into Java, with likely millions of disciples by the 1920s. And many of the current day branches of Shadhili Sufism in Algeria, Morocco, North America, Europe, and so on are branches of this Alawi tradition. So this brings me to the 2020s. I talked about the 1820s with Darqawi, the 1920s with Al-Alawi, and the 2020s has seen the rise of yet another major Moroccan Sufi master known as Sheikh Muhammad Fawzi al-Karkari. He is from northern Morocco, roughly the same region where Imam al-Shadhili is from, and where many of the great expositors of the Shadhili way have come from. And he's young, born in the 1970s, born in 1974. I was involved in the translation and editing of a short biography on his life called At the Service of Destiny, that was written by his Tunisian disciple Jamil Zardoudi. His life is fascinating. His order stretches across all continents. He has branches in Morocco, most major cities in Morocco, France, Belgium, Egypt, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and North America. He had an abusive childhood, which led him to commit suicide. And he survived the attempt and went on a 10-year journey where he lived, he was homeless for 10 years, wandering Morocco from Saint Tomb to Saint Tomb, spending most of his time in reflection and prayer, working menial jobs, eating from garbage cans when he couldn't find food, wandering the deserts in the old renunciant way, and returns to his family after 10 years, completely transformed, and he goes to his uncle, who is a low-key Shadhili Sufi sheikh or Sufi master in northern Morocco, and joins this branch of the Alawi Shadhili tradition in northern Morocco, quickly arrives to the end of the spiritual path as defined by the Alawiyya, inherits the function of this low-key uncle of his. I had never heard of him, even though I personally grew up in Morocco. I had never heard of this branch of the Shadhiliyya. Very quickly begins to attract disciples throughout Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Arab world, but also France. As a sheikh who's lacking in formal education, never graduates from high school, attracting disciples from all walks of life who live in this zawiya, in this convent, this hospice in a small town called Al-Arwi near Nador, with disciples from all cultures, speaking different languages. He's a remarkably creative and original and dynamic reviver of the Shadhiliyya in the 21st century. And I've been working partly on understanding the Shadhili tradition in and of itself, as well as the continuation of this tradition through the writings of al-Karkari and his own disciples who are also producing works themselves. I have a podcast called The Sufis of Morocco, which I have, I started with Khalid Williams, a prolific translator of North African Shadhili literature. And we translate the Q&As, the responses between the Sheikh and his disciples regarding their visions, their dreams. We're working on his commentary on various verses of the Quran, discussions of practice of Sufism. And through this podcast, the Sufis of Morocco, which is on iTunes and all platforms that carry podcasts, you can see the development and revival of Sufism rooted in this centuries-old North African tradition, but at the same time renewing it, reviving it with an intense emphasis on direct experiential knowledge, intense renunciatory practices like continuous fasting, an emphasis on wandering, since the Sheikh himself wandered for 10 years in Morocco. So you have these French disciples walking from Paris to Morocco over the course of 3 months, dressed in these bright cloaks, these bright clothings, practicing voluntary poverty, and living with the Sheikh and his family. He has 7 daughters and 2 boys, and they all live, it's a young family, and the male and female disciples live at various levels or floors of this convent. So this book that I translated, among others, it's called Introduction to Islamic Metaphysics. The Arabic is Kaful Astar lima fiha il jalalati min asrar, which translates as the kaf of curtains over the ha of secrets. Very abstract, abstruse, and at first impenetrable, the title. And the prose itself is also fresh and dense, and it can be frustrating and extremely rewarding. For al-Karkari, there's no ontological rupture between the eternal and the temporal. And the book is structured around what he calls the 7 secrets of the divine name, Allah. That is to say, the letters of the name themselves represent different stages of progression on the path to God. So the emphasis on the name, as I explained earlier, is a very Shadhili theme. But the way in which he's doing it is distinct. The 7 readings, what he calls the 7 readings of the name, and 7 stages of progression through the name. An emphasis on transmission of knowledge about the name through direct vision. In other words, his training with his disciples consists of interpreting the experiences that the disciple is directly witnessing with the heart. So the concept is called mushahada, or I translate it as direct witnessing. Sometimes it's translated as contemplation, which is inaccurate. But what you find is a text that's steeped in experiential knowledge, whose author claims to be a realized saint, and who claims to be able to bring the contemporary disciple all the way to the end of the path, as per the great revivers of the Shadhiliya, like Al-Alawi, Al-Darqawi, Ibn Ata'illah, and others. And I say here, to quote him, he says, "Read this book with your heart before your intellect, and view it through the inner vision before the outer one. Swim with me in the world of the letter, that you may find something to give you peace of mind and dispel your thoughts, your doubts." One of the prominent themes in this work is the role and function of the friend of God, of the master, of the sheikh. The term in Arabic is wali. A wali, it's both active and passive. Waliyullah is a friend of God, it's someone whose affairs are led and governed by God on the one hand, and someone who performs tawalla, performs worship and perfects you might say, the human relationship to the divine. So someone who is aligned with God, and someone whom God aligns himself with. So the wali, and this you might say ismis or liminal nature of the friend of God, or the function of the saint in the path to God, or as a liminal portal between the created and the eternal, is consciously discussed and elaborated upon in this text. And like the Shadhilis, it's seen as an indispensable element of the path. In other words, you can't walk the path by reading the books. You need some bookish knowledge to do it, but it doesn't get you there. In fact, most of the time, it's an obstacle, because you have a theoretical understanding and expectations of what the path is, and you project them upon what your experience is, and you start interpreting things through the veil of your discursive knowledge instead of directly accessing them through experience. One of the most remarkable aspects of this book, this Introduction to Islamic Metaphysics by al-Karkari, is his discussions of the nature of language. He's not formally trained, his Arabic is sometimes broken, he doesn't graduate from the Azhar, the Qarawiyyin, or the great centers of learning, and he challenges the structures of scholarly authority on the ground in contemporary Morocco, among not only the Sufis, but also the, you might say, exoteric or the formal scholars. Mystics always complain about the inadequacy of words to express their experiences, but they glory in them. They indulge in rhetoric, they love poetry, they express the inexpressible. And so the great riddle of describing the divine essence is something that the mystic relishes. And it's the great paradox of the path. What kind of direct relation can there be between the absolute and the relative, the real and the non-existent, the infinite and the finite? What's the adequate simile? Where's the bridge? For al-Karkari, the bridge is direct vision. And it's described in the Quran through the verse of light. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. The likeness of his light is as a niche in which is a lamp, and so on. It's a very famous verse, but what you see is non-delimitation, God, then delimitation to a certain extent, light of the heavens and the earth, and then exemplification of that abstraction, the likeness of his light, the likeness of that non-delimited reality is as, and then you enter into delimitation, niche, lamp, resplendent planet, and so on. So language doesn't convey it, but the Quranic language of exemplifying the non-delimited is, you might say, it's where the tension is resolved in the book. It's finally resolved through the direct experience, you might say, of the verse of light. A wonderful quote he says here, the Shaykh al-Karkari says, "The one who speaks is mistaken, while the one who remains silent is in error." Another prominent theme is immanence and transcendence, and he criticizes the dominant theological tradition in Islam for excessive emphasis on transcendence at the expense of immanence, at the expense of the as-if of the religion. The likeness of his light is as a niche, or as the Prophet of Islam describes the station, or the highest pinnacle of the religious experience, he describes it as to worship God as if you were to see him. So excessive transcendence, tanzih, is an obstacle, you might say, or an excess that the Shaykh here tries to press back on, to emphasize notions of immanence, of divine comparability, in verses, for instance, where Moses in the Quran faints after witnessing a mountain collapsing and he has a divine vision, and so on. So this, through language, through discussion of theological principles of transcendence and immanence, this contemporary expositor of the Shadhili way really is trying to express what it means to become realized in the Sufi path, Tahqiq. It's not simply the ability to expound metaphysically on things. It's rather the direct witnessing of it in a visionary, ocular manner, not in an abstract way that in English we'd say, for instance, "Oh, I have had an insight." An insight is not what they mean when they say, these Shadhilis, when they say direct mushahada. So the key tensions of the book between immanence, transcendence, theory and practice, heart and mind, are resolved in what he calls the secret, or as-sir, classical Shadhili term, which is experienced, known directly. Hence the importance of the master in describing, or you might say, explaining the experiences that the disciple goes through on their journey to God, which I try to offer translations of in the Sufis of Morocco podcast, just to get a sense of how he approaches issues of method and practice. What I find compelling about the writings of Sheikh Muhammad Fawzi al-Karkari is the fact that he both stands as you might say, a bridge between the early tradition, while at the same time is marking a rupture from it and a revival thereof. Certain themes that are emphasized in this text, as I said, they are classic themes that you find throughout the tradition. But at the same time, the emphasis on personalized experience, on the limits of language and book learning, on the indispensability of direct witnessing, not just of, you might say, an emotive understanding or state or affective state, but of direct visionary experience as the criteria for wayfaring, has been very illuminating for me as someone who works on the intellectual history of Sufism, but never quite understood that point. Now that I reread the text that I've studied from the Sufi tradition, I've come to learn that they all emphasize that point, the point of mushahada, which I used to translate as contemplation. But it's actually, you might say, the yardstick for assessing one's progress on the path. The eye of the heart is either turned toward other than God or toward God. And this notion of mushahada is one of these central themes that hasn't been explored very carefully in contemporary literature on pre-modern Islam. See, contemporary scholarship on Sufism tends to focus on abstract, complicated, metaphysical discourse that is produced by these authors. What you see in this living order is the same level of sophistication that you would find in the famous expositors like Ibn Arabi and others, but at the same time, an emphasis on direct tasting before reading. So as someone who teaches texts, I find this living text to be one that has helped me understand and reframe the concerns that these authors whose texts we read, where their concerns lie. Let me conclude by reading a short passage from the book, from the first chapter, entitled As-Sir, the innermost secret, this place where the tension is resolved. Al-Karkari reads, he says, "To directly experience the innermost secret of the path, you must learn to live it. You must clothe your states in it, sleep with it, and wake up to it. You must smell, taste, and feel it. You must pray and fast with it. You must observe all the prescriptions mandated by the law, while being present with it through direct experience and witnessing, until it yields to you the fruit of your incapacity to know him, the fruit of your ajz. This incapacity will then take you to a higher level of understanding of the innermost secret, until you arrive at the farthest limit of your spiritual aspiration. At that point, the second secret begins of the path. Now, the innermost secret occurs in the letters, in the guise of two letters, one that's visible above the line and another that's hidden beneath it. The innermost secret, then, is to witness existence in a state of non-duality. It is to be neither near nor far. It is to be incapable of invoking him and to recognize God without a trace. It is to know him and not to be ignorant of him. It is not to speak about him and not to be silent about him. It is to be neither dead nor alive. It is to bring together the two opposites, to drink the two oceans, and to be the meeting place between them. It is to recognize who you are and who he is and who I am and who we are. The innermost secret is to negate all things, then to affirm them. It is to see that all things hallow him through the voice of Laysa kamithlihi shay', nothing is as his like. So I hope you enjoyed this short discussion and contextualization of this contemporary Sufi expression of the long-standing Shadhili order. And there's a lot of contemporary literature on Sufism, on the Shadhili order, and on contemporary expressions of Islamic mysticism. I would refer you to the primary texts, first and foremost at this point. For the Al-Karkari's writings, I have translated a book called In the Footsteps of Moses, where he comments on the life of Moses in the Quran as a paradigm for the journey to God. His biography is called At the Service of Destiny, a biography of the living Moroccan Sufi master, Sheikh Mohammed Fawzi al-Karkari. There's also a text called Sufism Revived, where I translated his notions on prophecy, messengerhood, and extensive discussions of the nature of sainthood in the Islamic tradition. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you very much.